This session is going to focus on what else is going on in the body. So as these drugs course through your body for, a week at a time, they're obviously not just going to be acting at the level of the gut or the level of food intake. There are a lot of different body systems that are going to be involved, and we're going to cover that with four wonderful experts. So with that, we'll start with Dr. Husing, who will be talking to us about the pancreas as one of our first body systems. Mark?
Thank you to the organizers for having us up here. My name is Mark Husing. I am a faculty member at UC Davis. My lab is across the causeway. And what we do in my lab is we study the original target of incretin drugs, which is here. This is an actual 3D image of a group of islets that we labeled, we stained for different hormones that they produced. Most of the cells here, that pinkish red color, those are your beta cells. Those release the insulin that most of us care about, but there's also other cell types there, in green and in white, and those are two different cell types that are well known to many of us, but sometimes forgotten as to the role they play. We study how they work. These alpha cells and these delta cells really play a big role in shaping that insulin secretion that most of us care about. And most of us will know from our textbooks that the beta cells that release insulin don't do that when glucose levels are low, which is appropriate. But when glucose levels start to rise over a certain threshold, boom, your beta cells kick in, they release insulin. And that's when you get insulin talking to your peripheral tissues and taking away that insulin and storing it back into your liver or your skeletal muscle or your fat. We also know from our textbooks that alpha cells that release glucagon are really important as a counter-regulatory hormone. Whenever your blood sugar levels drop dangerously low, it's your alpha cells that kick in, talk to the liver, and make your liver produce more glucose and restore your glucose levels. However, your textbooks are still teaching us that these two hormones work in this kind of yin-yang fashion. They are functionally antagonistic hormones. And it's actually really exciting to be in this field because I think we're relearning that that's not the case. Yes, it is true that on the low glucose levels, alpha cells produce insulin, produce glucagon, and that's a really important life-saving physiological response. But during the prandial phase, when we're busy digesting a meal, these alpha cells, they don't oppose the beta cells. Their glucagon, as is indicated by that green arrow pointing from that alpha cell down to the beta cell, that green arrow is indicating a cooperation between alpha cells and beta cells. Alpha cell glucagon, or sometimes alpha cell GLP-1, is actively stimulating the beta cell to produce more insulin. And it's not just glucagon that does this. It's also in human islets, corticotropin-releasing hormone and acetylcholine. There are multiple signals coming from the alpha cell that activate the beta cell during the prandial phase, meaning this is a feature, not a bug. And then there is delta cells. Sean mentioned them in his slide. Delta cells make somatostatin. Somatostatin is an inhibitory hormone. And like anything in biology, you need to have some kind of feedback inhibition. Delta cells do that. They kind of keep the whole system from going off the rails and going off the track to make sure that once insulin levels are successful in bringing glucose levels back down, your delta cells are one of the mechanisms that make sure that we don't overshoot and produce too much insulin and get into hypoglycemic territory. So the hierarchy, the crosstalk that happens here, I think is important to summarize, and it all starts with the beta cell. The beta cell itself is a glucose sensor. It's really good at sensing glucose and translating that in an appropriate amount of insulin secretion. And as I'll show you in the next slide, those beta cells are actually tightly coordinated, almost like a cardiomyocyte, like a heart muscle. And they do that by gap junctions. And layered on top of that are these local layers of crosstalk. We call this paracrine crosstalk, where the alpha cell glucagon and the alpha cell GLP-1 and delta cell somatostatin kind of modulate beta cell output. And then the hormones and nutrients and neurotransmitters, some of the nutrients and precision nutrition that we're going to talk about today, they layer on top of that. They can talk and affect beta cells directly, but they can also affect this local layer of crosstalk that is baked into how an islet works. Now, this is all abstract and schematic. What we do in the lab is to actually take a deep dive and a closer look as to how this works in real time. I'm going to show you one simple vignette of that, where we're looking at islets where we engineered them so that they are lighting up in real time as these processes take place. I'm not going to bore you with the details. I'm going to show you simply a video where you're going to see on the right in green calcium, an important second messenger. And on the left, you see changes in another second messenger called cyclic AMP. both of these things are really important, and it's changes in these second messenger levels that really are underlying the insulin that comes out of these islands. And hear them respond in real time. And in doing so, we can get insight into the coordination between the cell types, the alpha cells and the delta cells, along with the beta cells. And in doing so, and in measuring what happens when incretin hormones are activating these cells, we can actually understand which incretin hormones are the best at driving a robust stimulation of secretion, and which ones are less so. And I think by doing so, we're learning that some of the ways that these incretin hormones that we all know and love and know work so well, some of the ways they work so well is because they are better at activating these signaling cascades I've just shown you. So the original target of the incretin hormones, I think, still have some secrets that they're revealing to us. And with that, I'll pass it on to Nick.
Cool. Thank you. My name is Nick Chavkin. I'm an assistant professor of pediatric cardiology at the University of Washington. I also get to run a lab at a Seattle Children's Research Institute. My lab is very interested in dynamic resilience of cardiovascular disease and the heart in particular. And I'm going to kind of give you some examples of what that means in context based on obesity. Also, I apologize for my voice. I was at the Mariners playoff game on Saturday, and that is why this is not going well in terms of microphone. As I think everyone here appreciates, obesity is accelerated aging. Everything in the body that obesity leads to is just everything that happens in aging, just fast-tracked. So much so that obese BMIs lead to reduced lifespan, but largely obese BMIs lead to not only reduced lifespan, but reduced healthy living by as much as 19 years. And this is really obvious in terms of mortality and cardiovascular disease. So obesity causes cardiovascular disease. And not only cardiovascular morbidity, but cardiovascular mortality. As BMI increases, vascular disease increases. I think this is all well known. And this is really true in terms of the kind of modifiable risk factors of cardiovascular disease in terms of hypertension, cholesterol, metabolic dysfunction, and inflammation. And so we're interested in this aspect because we see these as detriments to cardiovascular resilience. And so the idea of resilience here is that the heart gets stressed and injured all the time, and it has to respond in normal life. It is always beating. And so these aspects of age and obesity are reducing the heart's ability to resiliently respond to these aspects, and in order to kind of take damage and overall reduce its ability to function, and that leads to this syndrome of heart failure. And so one of the things that we got really interested in terms of in general, interested in things that can improve resilience of cardiovascular disease, improve resilience of the heart at a cellular level. And so that's what got really interested in these GLP-1 drugs. And as I'm sure people know here, there have been so many clinical trials now on cardiovascular disease, and specifically heart disease. A lot of them mainly through semaglutide, but improves cardiovascular outcomes in patients with type 2 diabetes, obesity-related heart failure. This is more HFpEF related. Oral semaglutide now with type 2 diabetes. Another oral semaglutide with cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. One with type 1 diabetes. I just saw a presentation recently saying that someone from type 1 diabetes saying that they're always kind of the second child to type 2 diabetes. So I want to throw this one in there too. And then I think most importantly to just general population is the SELECT trial that showed that obesity without diabetes is still beneficial towards cardiovascular outcomes. And to show that really specifically, there's a 20% reduction in cardiovascular events and a 15% reduction in cardiovascular mortality just by people taking semaglutide alone. I also like pointing out with these trials is that they see the same, even though it's very obvious these benefits to overall health and obesity and weight loss. They also seem the same dropout that everything else does. I think it's like a 10% dropout pretty consistently across the board. And so we were really interested in this. One, because all of these seem like, well, yeah, we know that obesity drives cardiovascular disease, and this seems like a great way to reduce that very direct effect on cardiovascular disease. I'm going to go next to just kind of we're asked to give provocative questions, right? So things that kind of were ongoing. There we go. Things that we're kind of interested in the lab and things that I'd love to discuss. One is there's clearly these indirect benefits on the heart to just reducing adipose tissue burden in people. And how that benefits cardiovascular outcomes. But there seem to be direct effects benefiting the heart as well. And that's super interesting. Super interesting to us. First is there was this great meta-analysis trial that says that in all of these clinical trials, GLP-1s show weight loss and reduction and reduction of cardiovascular events. There's actually no correlation between the two. So it seems like there's actually a lot of other benefits to GLP-1s. There's also there's a great paper, this great study published recently looking at a mouse model of cardiorenal metabolic dysfunction in HFpEF, showing that weight loss alone could reduce weight in the mice, or restricted feeding could reduce weight, but there were actually beneficial cardiovascular outcomes with GLP-1 treatment in these mice. So I think that there are mechanistic ways that GLP-1 drugs are actually working to benefit the heart and hopefully improve resiliency. Also have this idea that there might be a negative effect on cardiac muscle mass. And so when does this become too much of a negative effect is another important question. And then I just want to point out too, I'm at Seattle Children's. Another question that we have is do children have different responses to GLP-1 than adults? Seattle Children's, just looked this up in the databases. Seattle Children's has 10 to 20 new patients every month on GLP-1s. 72% of them are in the 95th percentile of BMI, and their median systolic blood pressure is 173. There are very sick kids who are now potentially getting treated with GLP-1s, and pediatric patients have the added either benefit or detriment of their hearts are still growing, they're still expanding all the way up until you're 20. And so we're very interested in what these drugs could be affecting at a pediatric setting. So thank you. I'll pass it on.
I'm Bob Roshanravan. I'm one of the physician scientists here at UC Davis, specializing in nephrology, which is kidney care. And my focus of my research is actually on lifestyle therapeutics for patients with chronic kidney disease to improve physical performance and metabolism. So why kidney disease? Well, kidney disease is a major public health burden and financial burden. Approximately 34% of adults older than 65 have chronic kidney disease or live with chronic kidney disease. And the end-stage kidney disease population accounts for less than 1% of Medicare beneficiaries, but it consumes more than 7% of Medicare dollars. So really a high burden. The kidneys are very important organs because they're involved in maintaining fluid balance, electrolyte acid-base balance, and also excretion of toxins, which when they accumulate can impact multiple organ systems and cause inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. As we all know, particularly the obesity and diabetes are particularly significant risk factors for development of chronic kidney disease. So it's no surprise that treatments for diabetes and kidney disease, particularly the incretin mimetic drugs, have a significant effect in slowing progression of chronic kidney disease or even developing chronic kidney disease. And Nick went through a couple of the studies, but I'll just highlight the FLOW study, which recently came out in spring of this year, that showed that even in diabetic kidney disease, it slows progression. Why is that? What are the role of incretins? Well, incretins, actually, there are receptors for GLPs in the kidney, and in particular, the kidney endothelium and also some of the tubules have incretin receptors. So the main actions on the kidney are to not only improve blood pressure response in these areas, they also reduce the sodium retention and improve natriuresis. They also have resident immune cells that actually are impacted, and so there is an anti-inflammatory effect on the resident immune cells. Incretin mimetic drugs have potential for patients with kidney disease, mainly because one of the reasons is that there's altered incretin homeostasis in patients with kidney disease. In this study that Dr. Cummings and I performed, we looked at non-diabetic chronic kidney disease patients and characterized their secretion patterns of incretins with an oral glucose tolerance test compared to controls. Everybody was non-diabetic. And as you can see here, that there is a elevated exposure to incretins in response to an oral glucose tolerance test. And there was also evidence of some end organ resistance because the incretin stimulation of insulin was suppressed. And in addition, there was also a inability to suppress the glucagon that you see here. Glucagon levels, which glucagon is as was referred to earlier, is a diabetogenic hormone, and it's also a catabolic hormone. In addition, one of the less recognized target organs affected by kidney disease with the retention of uremic solutes is skeletal muscle. And chronic kidney disease patients, if you look here on the bottom one, you can see there is a substantial amounts of intermuscular adipose tissue compared to controls that are recruited from the clinic. That has implications for not only metabolic health, but also physical performance. And as you could see here, as you get worsening kidney disease, going from chronic kidney disease to maintenance hemodialysis, this intermuscular adipose tissue accumulates. So the quality of the muscle is poor. And that correlates the infiltration of the intermuscular adipose tissue, as you see in the plot in the bottom, actually is directly related to poor energetic capacity of the muscle, measured using phosphocreatine magnetic resonance spectroscopy, P31 MRS. Interestingly, even modest exercise in these patients. We have a 12-week home personal training program that we have recruited patients into who have moderate to severe chronic kidney disease. And it's only moderate physical activity structured with a personal trainer over Zoom. And you can see in these patients, the oxidative capacity of the exercisers compared to the non-exercisers significantly and meaningfully improves, coinciding with a 39-meter increase in 6-minute walk test. So there is potential for just lifestyle therapeutics, and in particular exercise, to improve the metabolic health of muscles, even in debilitated patients with chronic kidney disease. And there is a role for the combination of therapeutics with the Ozempic-type drugs, the incretin mimetics. And that's where the future of our studies lie. We are hoping to see if we can improve muscle metabolic health and performance with the combination of our exercise program and in addition to incretin mimetic drugs, to see if we can get these improvements in muscle metabolism coinciding with performance rather than causing worsening exercise intolerance. Thank
you. So I'm Keith Baar. I'm professor. What I study is musculoskeletal health. So that means that I'm looking at how your muscles, your tendons, your connective tissues allow you to do the movements you want to do. The reason that I'm here is that one of the biggest things with all of the GLP-1 receptor antagonist or agonists, I should say, is that they're supposed to have this 40% of the weight you lose is supposed to come from lean mass. And so if that's coming from your muscle mass, that's then going to be problematic, because if we lose 40% of our muscle mass and then we stop the drug and we gain back all the weight, now we're going to have way less muscle mass, because in order to gain back the muscle, we actually have to do something. So we actually started looking at this because we wanted to understand where the lean mass was coming from. A lot of this work is done with my former postdoc. He's now a assistant professor at Charité in Berlin. And what we did is a simple thing, which we wanted to understand what was happening with muscle, but then we wanted to make things even a little bit worse. So what we do is we do these little 3D printed casts that we can put on a mouse. And so we can immobilize one leg. We can then have a non-immobilized and immobilized. We have them all on not a high-fat diet, but the American diet. So they're all gaining lots of muscle or lots of mass, fat mass mostly. And then what we did is we put them onto either
semaglutide, survodutide, which is GLP-1 together with a glucagon agonist, so that's a dual agonist, or we then did a pair-fed group, so calorically restricted. So we gave them, they were 1 day regressed, so we would measure the food, how much food did the ones who had the semaglutide or the survodutide eat. We then took the average, we then gave them that much food, and you can see that in the change in body weight, you can see that the pair-fed or the caloric restricted group lost exactly the same amount of weight. Okay, so the change in body weight between the three groups where we're seeing either the drug or where we've pair-fed them is exactly the same. Our ad libitum, we're injecting them, we're putting a cast on them, so they lose a little bit of weight just because of the stress of that. So what I wanted to show is the first thing is that we're not losing 40% of the mass that we're losing is not coming from skeletal muscle. So if we look at the ad libitum fed, you actually, because they're losing a little body weight, they're maintaining their muscle. The open bars in each group, that's the one that's not casted. The one that's casted is the closed bar, or the bars with the stripes in it. And so what you can see is that just like in humans, you're going to lose about 10% of your muscle mass. This is a week immobilization. So you're losing 10% of that muscle mass in a week. It's completely normal. Exactly the same thing we see in humans. If you are just losing some weight, and you're not casting the leg, you don't lose. If anything, your muscle mass gets bigger relative to your body size. If you look at any of the caloric restricted, the semi or the servo, in the control leg, what you see is that there's no actual greater loss in muscle mass from the drugs than if you calorically restrict. So, and we also know this because if you put in the drug as a pellet instead of daily injections and you get a constant level of the drug, you don't lose any body weight because they don't have the same effect on the mouse's desire to eat, and you don't see any loss in muscle mass in that situation either. So there's not a direct effect on muscle mass. So where is the lean, except maybe a little bit when we have that inactivity. So if you look at the light blue bar with the stripes in it, that's the casted leg with the caloric restriction. If you look at the two drugs, it might be having a tendency to be a little bit lower there, but it's not a dramatic effect. So that again speaks to what Bob was talking about, which is doing these things together. So if you're going to put somebody onto a GLP-1 receptor agonist, you want them to be doing something so that you can have them not be in the immobilized or sitting on their butt all the day. Because just having the immobilization, maybe that's going to have another effect. So where's the lean mass loss coming from? What you see is the lean mass loss is actually coming from the liver. So the livers actually went down by a factor of 2/3. So we're losing a huge amount of liver mass. And when you do the human studies and you just do, all you're doing is you're looking at it through DEXA. DEXA can't distinguish the liver mass as much as fat mass in the liver, or is it the liver as lean mass? Okay, and just to show you that there are some differences, if you look at the liver triglyceride levels, interesting thing here is that the semi and the survoglucide, so the GLP-1 receptor agonists, they see a nice decrease in liver triglyceride. Look at the caloric restriction. What you're doing in the caloric restriction sense is you're actually protecting the liver adipose. You're losing a lot more glycogen from the liver when you're just doing caloric restriction without the GLP-1s. The servo, because it's got the glycogen or the glucagon molecule in it, you're actually seeing more glycogen loss together with the triglyceride loss. Whereas the semaglutide alone, you're seeing only a little bit of a drop in the glycogen. So what we're seeing that a lot of what we're doing with the GLP-1s is that we're affecting dramatically the liver. We're not affecting as dramatically the muscle. And that was one of the things that I know in this group where we're thinking about things to maintain muscle mass. We still want to continue to want to do that because we're still losing about 20% muscle mass, but it's not different from caloric restriction. Whereas the liver, you can see that depending on which one you use, you're going to get different effects in the liver that are going to have metabolic effects throughout the body.
So complete. Thank you, guys.
So completes our journey around the body, right? So there's a lot of other physiological systems that are impacted, but I hope this gave you all a good sense that, the GLP-1s are very likely acting, not just in the tissues we think they are, but probably body wide. And this was just sort of a taste of that. So thank you guys very much. It's great. I wanted to riff off of something, if I may, on terms of my first question for the muscle guys, and that is, Nick, you came up with this idea that maybe in a pediatric setting there could be something different going on because you're talking about it. The muscles are still developing, the heart is still developing, and so on and so forth. That's a very different situation from like the mouse studies where they're already adults and now you're trying to put them on a high-fat diet. So I would just be really curious what your thoughts are on how this might impact muscle development, and has that ever been tested in even a rodent model?
So really quickly, just what the pediatric heart groups have done is through echo analysis have shown that heart size grows with body surface area in people. So it is really linked to how tall and how heavy you are as a child growing. And it's it's not sex based. It's not region based. Those are the two variables that define heart size, which is super interesting just on its own. But when you're talking about GLP-1s and adjusting that and potentially even reducing that is I don't think so no one knows what that does to pediatric heart size during growth. So that's why it's super interesting to me from the heart in a pediatric perspective. But yeah.
So this is a really great and very important question, because a lot of drugs in general are starting to be given to people younger and younger. We just finished a study where we were looking at a drug that's FDA approved for kids over 2. And we found that when we gave it to rats from day 7 to day 28, they actually ended up about 40% smaller. So they're about half the size, even though you're allowed to give it to people who are 2 years or older. And there's one case in the literature that said that they had somebody who was on it who came in and they were really, really small. And so there are lots of these cases, and especially when we're talking about drugs that are affecting insulin or insulin-like growth factors or other things that are really tightly regulated for developmental size, is going to be really important to understand those things. And that's not something that most people address when they're looking at these types of things.
So it's the old adage that children are not just little adults, right? But yet sometimes we think of that in medical terms. What would be just to take that one step further, what would be the key studies that would need to be done to sort of ask how this is impacting that? And you sounds like you started to do some, Keith, but...
Yeah, so we do a bunch of studies where we start at about day 7 when in rats where they're young, but they're even getting their nutrition maternally. So you can do it through maternal injections, so you can see the effects of whether the drug passes through the milk, so you can get some of that. And I think that that's really important to then get weights and see what development looks like and do some of these analysis and look at it over time. And we look at all the systems, and in the model that I was talking about, basically everything was proportionally smaller. The heart was smaller, the everything except for the spleen, because the drug that we were looking at affected the spleen. But everything was proportionally smaller. So those types of things where you look and you watch development in a very shortened period, because you can look at a model organism, really important to find fundamental things that are associated with growth and development within these systems.
Yeah, I'd say on top of that too. So we do the mouse studies in a similar manner. But the more people that get on these drugs, the more kids that get on these drugs, the more clinical data there will be, and the more we can actually compare. It is right because there are. I think it's very clear, but and from everyone else, there's direct effects of these drugs on cells, on tissues that are not the intended target. Mostly probably beneficial too, because these drugs are working better than you'd expect. But trying to figure out what those are doing in developmental context would be very important. And it's also hard to separate those aspects in a clinical setting. But so just more numbers, more people.
And I'll head over to Bob next, if that's okay. So you've mentioned, I think maybe even in your talk, the relationship, there is a sort of a crosstalk between kidney function and muscle. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, and then I'll bug you with another question maybe right after that, Bob.
Sure. I think the main mediators of the effect of kidney disease on muscle metabolism and also muscle atrophy are the reduced kidney function, causing not only an increase in the accumulation of these uremic toxins from the gut microbiome that accumulate because of the impaired excretion. Those actually have a direct effect on muscle mitochondrial functioning. There have been animal studies that have shown that. To date, we're trying to see if this is a factor in humans, but most of the studies that looked at it were actually in kidney disease induced in mice. There's also classic studies that looked at acid accumulation with kidney disease with 5-6 nephrectomized mice. And there's a lot of data to support that in animal models, at least, that there is an effect of the metabolic acidosis on impaired insulin signaling. These can be related to post-insulin receptor defects, but there is a thought that is one of the factors involved. So when we consider diet in patients with kidney disease, the paradigm has shifted toward more alkaline diets to reduce the acid load on the kidney. And in part, that's not only considered it's controversial in terms of preservation of kidney function, but in animal studies, it shows that it does preserve some muscle.
Let me link it a little bit to food. Again, you sort of mentioned food, which a lot of folks in this room care about. So chronic kidney disease, there is a lot of dietary guidance around that already for several decades. Mm-hmm. Will that dietary guidance need to shift, in your opinion, with folks who are taking the GLP-1 drugs? Does it change the paradigm, in your opinion?
Yeah, the guidelines still haven't caught up. But even when you go to nephrology conferences, there is a understanding that the two things that have to be taken care of in this population that is nutritionally vulnerable is liberalization of protein intake, because our current guidelines are a little archaic. They recommend a very strict reduction in protein intake to less than 0.7 grams per kilogram per day, which is really difficult to achieve and less than the U.S. recommended daily allowance of these proteins. So increasing protein intake is one thing. And the other thing is these medications are associated with impaired thirst. And patients who have kidney disease require deliberate hydration to avoid kidney injury due to dehydration, because many of them are already on diuretics because they need to eject the salt from their high salt diets that they have. So dehydration is one factor, liberalization of protein restriction, and also making sure that they don't develop micronutrient deficiencies.
Yeah, I have a very good friend at ASU who would say water is the forgotten nutrient, actually. We don't think of water that much, but maybe we should, especially when, intake generally is down. Can I bug you next, Mark? Okay, great. Then you can speculate all you like too. It's kind of fun. But, when we think of these hormones, even the, sort of synthetic ones coming in and hitting these receptors, what do we know about how the drug is actually impacting other hormone systems, maybe glucagon secretion, or pick your favorite, at the level of the pancreas, for instance, or even other tissues? Do we know much about that?
I think there's a lot of things said about what incretin drugs do and don't do on not only insulin secretion, but glucagon secretion. Most people will know that incretins inhibit glucagon secretion, for example. The problem with that is if you want to engage in signaling, there needs to be a signal and a receptor for that signal on a cell. In mouse and probably human alpha cells, the receptor for incretins is not there. So how then do you explain mechanistically the observation that an incretin is inhibiting glucagon secretion? And I think that's an open question. I think a likely mechanistic explanation for that is to evoke some of this local crosstalk that I introduced in my slides that we know and start to understand better, where one way of doing that is having an incretin drug not only activate a beta cell, which we know it does, but also activate these delta cells, these professional inhibitors. And these delta cells are really good at inhibiting glucagon secretion from alpha cells. So it is not so hard to envision how the known effects of incretins on glucagon secretion are mediated not directly by acting on an alpha cell, but via one cell in between, which is a professional inhibitor cell. The other reason why the glucagon suppressive actions are a little hard to reconcile with incretin mimetics is the way that we know these receptors are signaling. We know that all these incretins signal through receptors that are coupled in a way that is always going to promote exocytosis. And how then does an incretin promote exocytosis of the beta cell, where the payload is insulin, but actually do the exact opposite, inhibit exocytosis of a very similar cell, which is the alpha cell, that from a signaling perspective, that is really hard to reconcile. And again, taking that delta cell, like indirect route, would solve that as well. So I think there is a lot of circumstantial evidence to point at the actual mechanism for that known glucagon suppressive effect is mediated through the delta cell. And I think you made a comment in the beginning that in order to treat a disease, you have to understand the disease. I've been amazed at working in islets for 20 years now, how I don't think we even understand how a simple thing like an islet with only 3 cell types actually works. And I think it is helpful to understand that better, because then you can be more precise in how you target the beneficial effects you want, which in a perennial phase might actually be a combination of a little bit of glucagon from the alpha cell to really just help the beta cell promote insulin secretion most effectively, which is how a healthy pancreas gets that done.
It's not complicated or anything.
It's not. It is amazing.
Keith.
I just wanted to add one thing there that Mark brings up, and that's that the receptor is really important. But all the tissues I talked about, neither the liver nor the muscle has a receptor for GLP-1. And so we see these huge effects on these tissues, but they have to be either indirect or they're happening in some sort of small pool of these cells that are then signaling locally to have that local effect. And so we still don't know what it is. And so, a lot of this is that there's a commercial drive that's really, really fast, and it's there because there's a big need. But the science is way behind where that commercial drive is. And so that's, again, what we're looking to, we have to pick up the pace, and but again, that research has to come. And a lot of the research is coming at the whole body, the whole organism level, and that's great. But if you still don't understand how it's working in the pancreas, you're not going to be able to understand how it's working at the whole body or what the potential consequences are, which is the other side of that.
So let me I'm going to stretch that one. It's going to be really stretched here, Justin, to food. And that is, a lot of these things operate through the neurons, right? Even the localized neurons in the gut or, circa the pancreas, even the muscle and liver are regulated metabolically by neuronal discussions with the brain. So there may not be a receptor on the particular target tissue, but if the brain is responding and coming back to that target tissue. So how might, I don't know, open question, how might food maybe modify some of these peripheral effects, and might this neuronal stuff be part of this sort of, the depression, the lack of the food noise, all of those sorts of things? Maybe it's all operating through more of a neuronal pathway. Anybody want to riff off of that?
So for a lot of that, you're looking at, you've got not only the neuronal component, but you've got the gut itself and the microbiome that's within the gut. And so we, again, know very little. And I think Bethany spoke about it a little bit this morning. And we're still trying to understand how a lot of these things, because yes, it's being created. Originally, GLP-1 is coming from the gut, and that's where it was originally created. And that's what evolutionarily, that's where it was supposed to come from. And so it's obviously responsive to food. But then how does the change in diet that's happened over the last, 100 years take into account what was happening for the last 40,000 years of evolution, where you've got this evolutionary change, but now we've got a dramatic shift in what we're supplying in the last 100 years. Now we're co-opting what we've done for evolution, and we're changing dramatically what we're using it for and how it's produced. And so whether that's from microbiome itself, whether that's from a neuronal component of a gut-brain interaction, I have no idea, and hopefully somebody is looking at that, but it's not going to be me in that one. But yeah, I think it's a really important question.
Just one thing I think is understudied in the field is we have to remember that the GLP receptors are also on immune cells, and immune cells are localized within every organ system. When you have metabolically unhealthy obesity, the accumulation of lipids has outgrown its blood supply. One of the thoughts is this hypoxia paradigm for inflammo-obesity, where the vessels just cannot keep up with the lipid accumulation, and that triggers this inflammatory response and release of inflammatory adipokines. I think more studies need to be done localized to fat tissue and seeing what's happening to the immune phenotype within the adipose tissue in response to these medications. So there may be an immune modulatory effect that is yet to be explored, because the perirenal fat, which I had on my slide and didn't have time to go into, that perirenal fat is a source of inflammatory adipokines that can damage a kidney tissue. And just reduction of that fat reduces the inflammatory response in the kidney. So it's important to keep that in mind.
I can add really quickly to the heart. The perivascular adipose tissue is absolutely, adipose tissue covers the coronary arteries, and disruption of that in obesity absolutely drives coronary artery disease. On top of that, a failing heart it changes its metabolic structure, so it uses different fuel sources, linking to everything you're saying. And then the last thing that you reminded me of is that an aged heart actually reduces its neuronal connections. So that's one of the things that happens in aging in a heart, is that the neurons start to die off that are connected to the brain. It's clearly you're not thinking about how to beat your heart, but it's all the other types of connections that are there. So all of that might get disrupted with age and obesity.
I mean, so your original question, like how much of this is through neural interactions, and I mean a lot of it is. We know that we learn more about this. Clearly, some of the benefits of these incretin drugs are on the original target, the beta cell, and the cells around the beta cell that shape that. As I indicated in the overview slide, we know really well that pancreas, the islets in particular, are heavily innervated. And a lot of the beneficial effects we're learning of these incretin mimetics are by changing reward, food-seeking behavior, food aversive behavior, and I think these all interact with each other and provide the maybe like sometimes larger than expected benefits that you would get from just having a drug that acts on the beta cell alone. And then you have the really massive benefits of just the rapid metabolic improvement itself that have all these knock-on side effects that are better as well. And if this sounds like a little hand wavy, it is because I think there's lessons to be learned here, and that how the actual signaling happens at a single cell molecular level, which we are starting to look at now. I think the lessons that we're learning there on a beta cell will probably be, I would not be surprised if those beneficial long-term signaling that happens in response to a short burst of an incretin will not be unique to a beta cell. But I think that signaling may have similarities in a neuron or even a cardiomyocyte or maybe even an immune cell, because it's all signaling downstream of an incretin receptor, and a lot of that is going to be somewhat conserved between different cell types in the body. And I look forward to learning more how the things that we are looking at, how some incretins work so well on a beta cell, if these same incretins also work so well on a cardiomyocyte or a neuron, in providing or explaining some of the therapeutic benefits that we know that they have, but can't quite explain with what we know about signaling today.
And I want to open the floor to questions, so be gearing up, okay? Be ready, everybody. But to kind of prompt this a little further here, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize who are in the food business is the gut is the largest, one of the largest, immune tissues in the body, and one of the most innervated tissues in the body, other than the brain. Right. So as people are changing their food, habits, or the amount of food they're taking in, or they're changing what they're eating, you might instantly imagine that all of those signals, which are normally interrogating the gut, are changing. And that may be in part some of these indirect effects that we've been talking about. So before I go to the floor with questions, I'm going to bug the muscle and heart folks a little bit more and say, I want to hear a little bit more about potential impacts on function. So we talk about lean body mass, muscle mass, these sorts of things. We talked a little bit, Bob, showed a little bit on mitochondrial function, which made me happy. But what about things like proprioception and balance? What about things like strength? Other, I'll leave it to you all to speak to that. Same thing for the heart function. What's going on with those things?
Yeah. So the study that I showed that Henning Langer is the first author on, it's now 3 mouse studies and a human study, and basically they show the same thing, that relative to their mass, so you're losing 20% of your mass, you're not losing 20% of your muscle, you're not losing 20% of your strength. So strength relative to mass is improving. And that's really good, because one of the things that you saw in the pharmaceutical industry is that, we're losing 40% of our mass. Let's buy a company that has a muscle building component to it. And they went out and they did stuff that inhibited myostatin, and myostatin has the reverse effect, which it increases muscle mass, but doesn't increase strength proportional to the mass. And so it actually increases disability. So the fact that you're actually improving ability using these drugs is a positive effect. I didn't show any of the tenon work, but the tenon actually is slightly better with the GLP-1 agonist. And again, we don't necessarily think that that's because of a direct effect. We think that's probably because of the decrease in inflammation, which has a direct negative effect on it. And so as far as function, they actually seem to be having a really good effect on function, at least in the small clinical studies that we've done.
There was a recent paper published that looked at intermuscular adipose tissue, which is purported to accumulate in patients with diabetes and obesity. And through this experimental model, they noticed that the increase in the intermuscular adipose tissue was directly related to a reduction in the time to fatigue of the muscle. So there is clearly a detrimental effect of that. And so the key question in our research group is really trying to figure out what is happening with the treatment of the intermuscular adipose tissue. Because as Keith so eloquently stated, it's not about muscle mass, it's about function, and you can improve the efficiency by improving the quality of the muscle.
And so for the mixed audience here, what you're talking about is the marbling of the muscle. I hate to gross everybody out, but
exactly.
Yeah.
Good for beef, not for muscle.
Before we go to the audience, did anybody else want to weigh in on the sort of functional aspects rather than the mass?
Yeah, just really quickly. So, obesity is linked to heart failure through inflammation, and that is the direct reduction in heart function is really inflammation, and so that's the idea, is to kind of reduce inflammation, increase overall ability for the heart to remodel.
All right, I think we go to the audience. Let's start with Dr. Lustig.
I have questions for all of you, but I'm not going to do that to you.
Okay, we have 11 minutes.
And I'm not going to do that to you. But I'm very glad, Dr. Roshanravan, that you just brought up that whole issue about the intramyocellular lipid being the important issue as opposed to the muscle itself. And that I want to take that and actually ask Dr. Chavkin to defend his statement that obesity is the driver, because we have patients with MC4R deficiencies who are markedly obese and have absolutely no problem with cardiac function. And we have patients with lipodystrophy who are actually thin, but have significant abnormalities in cardiac function. And the difference is the visceral fat as opposed to subcutaneous fat, which is really insulin resistance working at the level of the heart as opposed to the obesity itself. So I would challenge you that I think that you need to rethink that paradigm. Having said that, one of the things that increases intracardiac myocellular lipid that leads to the decreased ejection fraction and heart failure is, unfortunately, sugar, fructose-mediated lipid deposition into the cardiac muscle. My question to you is the reason that semaglutide and the other GLP-1 agonists working on improving cardiac function because of the reduction in sugar intake due to its other CNS effects? Or is there something specific going on in muscle?
So I would say absolutely it could be because of a direct sugar uptake intake. So I will say to you, you make a very good and distinctive point is that when I'm talking about obesity driving, it is absolutely visceral adipose tissue that is driving the dysfunction. It's the visceral adipose tissue that gets dysfunctional and starts to promote these kind of pro-inflammatory adipokines that are driving a lot of the cardiac remodeling that's seen in not necessarily heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, but heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. That's more of a stiff heart syndrome that's seen a lot of cardiorenal metabolic dysfunctions. I do think that there's not enough evidence to really be sure about this, right? But I do think that these GLP-1 receptor agonists are working to beneficially for sugar uptake. And I think that's potentially probably best seen in endothelial cells. I think you've seen this as well in the kidneys. But endothelial cells are very important in the vascular health of any tissue. And there's the overall health in any tissue, and they're very susceptible to both insulin resistance and glucose intolerance. And so they're and they express a lot of glucose uptake to bring glucose into the tissue. They actually also have more of a glycolysis pathway activated in order to use tissue to use energy, so that they can get their oxygen into the actual cells that need it. So there's lots that could be going on. A lot more, I think, mechanistic and cellular studies that need to be done to be able to confirm that. My feeling is that you're right in that it's affecting glucose uptake and glucose use.
Hi, Abigail Stevenson from Mars. As we start to see real-world data emerging on the use of these drugs, there are two trends. There's intermittent use and there's microdosing. Could you say a little bit about how you think those trends might affect the body systems? You know, you've been describing pretty pure clinical trials where use of the drugs, or rodent studies where use of the drugs is really tightly controlled. In real-world data, we're seeing that really isn't the case. Could you describe a little bit about what you think those effects may be?
So I deal with a clinical population, and the whole microdosing phenomena I'm not particularly attuned to. But, you know, one of the things that have come out from clinical trials, particularly those with the withdrawal of these medications, is that the clinical trials that combined exercise, nutrition, and these medications, after the withdrawal of the medication itself, exercise was protective of the rebound. The S-Light study, which was done in Denmark, is a classic one with the 52-week post-intervention follow-up that showed, irrespective of whether patients received exercise or no exercise, exercise was protective. And that was done after the drug was stopped. So we always, as nephrologists in our group's practice, we always encourage movement and structured physical activity, because there is a role to prevent that rebound. They still gain weight, but it's definitely not to the magnitude of those that were in the medication alone group. So it's really important. Maybe somebody else knows about microdosing.
So again, from an athletic population and an aesthetic population, that's where I get a lot of the work that I do, and I understand a lot of what you're talking about as far as microdosing and cycling. Again, Bob hit it exactly right, whether it's microdosing, whether it's cycling, what you're going to do for the longevity of being able to keep off weight or be able to maintain a lower weight is going to be dependent. And we know this from years of studies beforehand. The exercise is not great for losing weight, but it's great for maintaining weight once you've achieved the weight. So it's a much better way to do it. It doesn't prevent the rebound completely, but it's going to minimize that to a large degree. The big caveat with a lot of these things is that we go out and we say, you should exercise to our patients, and then they go out and they aggressively exercise and they all get hurt. And the reason they all get hurt is because we've shown that high fat diet and all of these things actually have really negative effects on the connective tissues that allow them to transmit that force. So you have to actually be smart about the exercise you're giving. You can't just go out and say, oh, you should go and do these things, because in an aggressive diabetes study that also came from Denmark. And again, Novo Nordisk is leading a lot of these things to try and understand this. But basically, if they were in the aggressive group with exercise and nutritional interventions in the diabetic group, they had 3-fold higher rates of tendon injuries that led to disabilities. And so we just have to be a little bit concerned about that component. And again, that's one of the reasons why we looked at the tendon function with the GLP-1 agonist, is because we were wondering whether this would make things progressively worse in that tissue. And we were pleasantly surprised that we actually saw a little bit of an improvement there. So it's potentially going to be somewhat protective against the thing that we have problems with in these populations who are trying to get to exercise. We're desperately trying to get them to exercise, and they go out and they do it and they get hurt. And they're like, oh, I should never have done that. And then they go and they're going to rebound even higher.
Before we go to the next question, I just had a thought, maybe going off of that a little bit, if I understood your question right. Abigail? Yeah, Abby. Is that you do wonder about some of these effects in these other tissues, whether you actually need to have such a high concentration, such a high dose that you would have for all the weight loss part, right? I believe that's been kind of understudied, meaning can you go with a much lower dose and alleviate a lot of these other problems? And the weight might not come off as much, but maybe you've got a much healthier liver and so on. Just a thought. Question.
That was the perfect segue for me. My name is Sebastian. I represent a natural ingredient company. So many companies out there promote fiber-rich products as nature's Ozempic. And so one of the questions I have is, does the research and the knowledge we gain now about GLP-1 has the potential to give us new research, new insights about fiber and how fiber works in the body? And my second question is, you all have laid out the gaps we have right now in understanding. When do we have to meet again in this setting to have a really solid understanding? Is it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, where we can say, okay, we actually got a good understanding now of how those things happen?
Well, we'll have to ask AG1 and IIFH about when the next meeting is, but maybe 5 years. I don't know. It's a great question on the fiber. Anybody want to kind of riff off of that or other functional foods?
Sure. I mean, I will riff off of that by acknowledging that, many of this work on the basic science side simplify what we study to a fault, because all we do is we add glucose. And we pretend that is a good enough mimetic for what actually happens when you or I will have our lunch after this session, and we know it's not the case. Alpha cells in mouse models in particular, and humans also, are arguably more responsive to protein, to amino acids than to glucose. Yet all textbooks still frame alpha cells as being inhibited by low glucose, or being activated by low glucose. They are activated under conditions of low glucose by other signals that are correlated with hypoglycemia, but it's not the lack of glucose itself that is the only, or maybe even the major thing that does that. And that's only talking about some of the major macronutrients. I'm leaving out fats. We know lots about fatty acids too. It's not even talking about how the other dietary compositions that happen in real world are impacting the basic biology that we're studying. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to really try and take the biology that we're studying, and maybe with some simple tweaks, actually bring that much closer to the mixture of nutrients and compounds that an actual cell, whether it's a cardiomyocyte or a liver or a beta cell, sees in a more in vivo-like setting, or a better mimetic of what happens in vivo. Because I guarantee you that we'll be seeing a lot more behavior of these cells in real time that mimics what you would be seeing in vivo if you could look in vivo at the same resolution. So I think we have all the tools to be able to do exactly what you're proposing to do, and we can apply them on short time scales.
So the biggest question that you had is how long? And so the how long component is dependent on how much we can do, and how much we can do is dependent on what we get as far as research funding, and that's going down. And so the thing is that it should be about 2 years would be fine. But if we're going to have this meeting, we're probably going to have it in Denmark in 2 years, because that's where a lot of the funding is to do a lot of the research. We're destroying that advantage that we have, and that's going to make it really hard for us to be competitive with those people who have now much more as far as their ability to do the research, because they have the money to hire people to do the types of experiments that really need to be done. And that's the real issue here as far as how long it's going to take. We could do it really quickly. It would just take person power to do that, and that person power requires funding, as everybody in here who runs a business understands. That's going to be the key component to how quickly you can get to that next milestone.
So let me turn that into a positive, Keith, if I can. I'll try. Just to end the session, before we close. I mean, I do think that lots of things are leading to this idea of, sort of partnerships with stakeholders, companies, states, fill in the blank to answer some of these questions. I think we need to be creative. And I think the people in this room have an opportunity to sort of be creative with some of us academicians, if you will, to answer some of these questions. So maybe we can meet in 2 years, despite the challenges we face now. So I think hopefully you can all appreciate that the GLP-1s impact a lot of different systems in the body. That's a take-home message. Another take-home message is, what's going on in the neurons and the immune system and all of these other things? And how does eating less food or different kinds of food impact these pathways? And should we be thinking about functional foods that not only maintain, muscle mass and do these other things we typically think about, micronutrients? Maybe we need functional foods that impact some of these other systems that we don't really even understand very much now. So with that, I want to thank Mark, Nick, Bob, and Keith for a wonderful session. Thank you very much, guys.